Welcome, everybody, and thank you for spending time with us out of your valuable days to talk about a very important topic, bluer oceans, sustainable seafood alternatives. I think from the video that we just saw encapsulates a snapshot of where we sit in May of 2021. And why we need to have not just have these conversations to spread awareness and to provide a little education, but we all need to do more than our part in solving for these critical issues. And we're extremely proud to present this series of webinars and content to be able to push those initiatives forward in a way that is engaging, in a way that is educational, and in a way that we ask each of you who are joining to be a part of the movement and to be a part of the solution with us. This doesn't happen with just the people that we'll be speaking with today. It happens with each of you that are listening. So we ask you to be engaging, ask questions when you can, and we will do our best to talk about why this is such an important topic for us. Today, again, we are talking bluer oceans, sustainable seafood alternatives, and it is presented by Emergence, Earth First Food Ventures, and the Good Food Institute. Today, we have some spectacular speakers here. My name is Elliot Chun. I lead Emergence. We will have each of our presenters introduce themselves as we go down the line, but Marika Azoff from Good Food Institute, Brian Rutzik from Earth First Food Ventures, Lou Cooper House from Blue Nalu, and Mako Vandermeer from Novish. With that, I'm going to pass it to Brian for an intro on Earth First Food Ventures.
Excellent. Thank you, Elliot, and good afternoon to everyone. And thanks for that kind intro, Elliot. Always love sharing the floor with you. As you mentioned, this is a series of webinars focused around alternative proteins. I believe this is our third in a series of 5 or 6. And really appreciate our partnership with the Good Food Institute as well. Today we have Marika Azoff, who will be one of the panelists and speakers, followed by Lou Cooper House from Blue Nalo and Michael Vandermeer from Novish to talk about our choices and alternatives in sustainable seafood. Earth First Food Ventures has been around now for several years, and we first dove into alternatives in sustainable seafood with our partners in Singapore back in 2017, a company called ADF Asset Management, Pure Salmon. That was actually land-based aquaculture with a technology out of Israel called Aquamoth. And we have since, as a company, diversified our efforts in the space towards plant-based assets, in this case, plant-based seafood, and cellular aquaculture as alternatives to sustainable seafood. And as our name implies, Earth First Food Ventures, we channel capital from our clients, family offices, investors towards those efforts. We have 3 verticals as a company: plant-based assets, whether it's vertical farming or B2C or raw material production. This is a huge space today compared to where it was just 10 years ago, but still minuscule compared to the entire protein space. I believe plant-based is just approaching shy of 2% of alternative proteins for total protein consumption on the planet. So small, but growing and dynamic industry. The other 2 verticals where we're increasingly getting involved is in relatively new technologies that don't yet have scale, but it's coming, are cellular agriculture, which Lou Cooper House is here to represent in the form of Blue Nalo, and fermentation as alternative potentials for protein going forward. Again, no scale, no production yet, but prototypes and proof of concept are there. This is a matter of time before these industries, in our opinion, scale significantly. And together with plant-based cell ag and fermentation, we believe that the industry is ripe for alternative proteins to grow high double digits and take a bigger chunk of total protein, whether it's 10, 16, or 22% of global protein consumption in the next 10, 15 years, it's going to be a much significant number than the current 2%. I'd like to turn it over to our panelists, and starting with Marika Azov from the Good Food Institute to set the tone for today's conference and webinar around engaging corporates, investors, and entrepreneurs and bringing them all together under this umbrella of alternative proteins, and in this case, sustainable seafood. Marika.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you, EFFV and Emergence, for inviting GFI to participate in this webinar. I'm so excited to talk about this opportunity. My name is Marika Azov, as has been discussed, and I am the Good Food Institute's corporate engagement specialist, but I focus on our sustainable seafood initiative. You can go to the next slide, please. So I have a 15-minute introduction, and during it, I'm just gonna introduce the Good Food Institute, discuss our sustainable seafood initiative, and give a very brief overview of the industry landscape. So I'll drop some links in the chat at the end if anyone's interested in learning more about our work, and I'll include my email too. It's hard to put it all in 15 minutes, but I'll do my best. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Good Food Institute, or I'll probably refer to it as GFI, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're dedicated to accelerating the shift to a sustainable, healthy, and just food system. So we're funded 100% by philanthropy, and to brag for a minute, we have earned GuideStar's Platinum Seal of Transparency, which is an honor obtained by less than 1% of nonprofits. So GFI has over 100 staff around, oh, sorry, you can go back to the last one. Thank you. I'll just say when to switch it for ease. Thanks, Elliot. So we have over 100 staff in 6 regions of the world. We have US offices. We have offices in Brazil, India, Europe, Asia Pacific, and Israel. And we focus on 3 key programmatic areas. So our science and technology department is a team of PhD scientists who work to advance and open source the foundational science of alternative proteins. And then we have corporate engagement, which is my team, and we build relationships with the world's largest food manufacturers, meat companies, restaurants, retailers, and really help them capitalize on opportunities in alternative proteins. And we also provide support to industry entrepreneurs, startups, investors, and financial institutions. And our policy team advocates for fair regulation of plant-based and cultivated meat, and lobbies for government investment in sustainable protein research and development. You can go to the next one, please. So GFI believes that the answer to many of the questions that our current food systems present, many of the issues that our current food systems present, is to make the meat, egg, and dairy products that people love, but just in a more sustainable and efficient way. So with alternative proteins, as Brian mentioned, we can make proteins directly from plants. We can make plant proteins using fermentation technology or using animal cell cultures. And GFI works to accelerate the transition to alternative proteins by helping companies make products that are delicious, affordable, and accessible. And our 3 programmatic areas work to create resources and share them freely. So all of our research, our data, and our insights are open access, and we both encourage and fund open access research in the field. And there are endless ways that we do and can support the alternative protein ecosystem, but we're really strategic in how we focus our efforts, and we tend to focus mainly on the white space opportunities where too few people are working. So that brings us to our sustainable seafood initiative, which you can go to the next slide and then the next slide. So our sustainable seafood initiative, which I might refer to as SSI because it's a mouthful. It's a cross-programmatic team at GFI. We work globally, and we work specifically on alternative seafood. So we cover all 3 programmatic areas. Jen Lammy, who is on the call, but you can't see her face. She's joined us today. She manages the Sustainable Seafood Initiative. Then we have in SciTech, our PhD scientist, Claire Baumkamp, who works on cultivated seafood. And then I lead our seafood specific global corporate engagement work. So I support startups, companies, and investors in the space, including conventional meat and seafood companies, to help them capitalize on opportunities specific to alternative seafood. And then we have our entire incredible policy team supporting our SSI initiative through identifying opportunities for public support, clearing the path to market for plant-based and cultivated seafood, and so much more. You can go to the next slide, please. So I already mentioned this, and there's a lot more information about these 3 different production platforms on our website. I urge you to check them out. But the term, when I say alternative seafood, I'm referring to seafood being made directly from plants, using fermentation technology to create seafood or seafood ingredients, and seafood made directly from cells, which we call cultivated seafood. Next slide, please. So why do we need alternative seafood? Why alternative seafood? We have trends such as an increase in population, rise and projected rise in seafood consumption, and that coupled with the unsustainable overfishing of our oceans, all driving, excuse me, of course I get a delivery during this presentation. All of that driving the need for these alternative solutions to creating seafood. Next slide, please. So we all know that as income increases, so does the consumption of animal protein. So the global demand for seafood is projected to be 30% higher than 2010 levels by 2030. On the left side of this chart, of this slide, we can see data from the UN showing the breakdown of where populations will be greatest as we approach 10 billion people on the planet by mid-century. So we can see that the population growth will continue over the coming decades and will be strongest in those lower and middle income countries. And at the same time on the right, we see that income growth will be largely driven by those countries with the fastest growing populations. Next slide, please. So we talk about alternative seafood as having a lot of potential to help meet that growing demand. And I like this graph from the World Resources Institute because it helps us visualize that demand. So we know that we can't get a lot more from our oceans than we already do. Wild-caught seafood catch rates have been largely stagnant since about 1990. And as you can see here, they're projected to decline in the coming decades. And the Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that only 7% of global fish stocks are underfished, and the rest of the ocean is already fished at maximum capacity. That's good. And the aquaculture has grown to keep up with demand over the past several decades, but projections do show that growth slowing based on industry-related challenges. The next slide, please. Great. Oh no, sorry. It's confusing because the one right before that, and then one more. Thank you. So while fishing and aquaculture continue to improve on sustainability metrics, we see alternative seafood as an opportunity to diversify and supplement the total global supply of seafood. So it offers new forms of seafood production to help meet the growing demand, and it's also a largely untapped market white space. So we have the Impossible Whopper being sold in Burger Kings across North America, and it's becoming a household name, but we don't really have anything like that in the plant-based seafood world yet. You can go to the next slide, and then, yeah, thank you. What does the alternative seafood industry look like right now? And I don't have a lot of time to go into it in depth, but just like to show this map and chart, which have the global concentration of conventional seafood consumption and production per capita as of 2017. So if you just click one forward, it should circle something, that's great. And you can just see that the per capita consumption is highest in Europe and Asia, with North America right behind those. So GFI really focuses on those 3 markets in our work with alternative seafood. Next slide, please. So when we look at the map of the leading alternative seafood companies and startups in the world, we see an obvious concentration in California and Europe, but really plenty of room to continue expanding in all regions. So seafood preferences among consumers vary largely by region. So there's still a lot of room to create products that suit different markets around the world. Next slide, please. So while our work is global, we do have the best data, the best sales data for the US. So the next two slides are US focused. Alternative seafood is really well positioned to capitalize on the momentum of the rest of the plant-based industry, which is growing rapidly. So kind of as a starting point to help us quantify this opportunity, we can look at where plant-based meat is today. So plant-based meat makes up about 1.4% of the dollar share amount of all meat products in retail in the US, meaning conventional meat, conventional animal-based meat, as well as plant-based meat. So compared to plant-based meat's 1.4%, plant-based seafood only makes up about 0.1% of the dollar share amount of all seafood products in the US, which is a $15 billion industry. So as just a starting point, just increasing the dollar share amount of seafood by 1.3%, so that it's on par with where plant-based meat is today, we're looking at a $221 million opportunity. And we know that the majority of seafood purchases are made away from home. So because this is just in retail, this opportunity is many times larger when we factor in restaurant and food services. You can go to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, it's looking funny on the screen. My apologies. So we can also take it one step further and compare plant-based seafood's dollar share to that of plant-based milk, which is at 15% of all milk sales. So for plant-based seafood to reach 15% of total seafood shares, we're now looking at a $2.5 billion opportunity. You can go to the next slide, please. So in the past few years, we've seen an increase in investment in the space. This slide shows an overview of recent investment activity for both plant-based and cultivated seafood companies. And I should note that this only includes disclosed amounts, so it's most likely significantly understated. And investment activity has continued to increase over the last 4 years as new companies are launched and investors are increasingly identifying the significant opportunity that alternative seafood presents. So just in the last couple months, the first couple months of 2021, we've already seen the total investment capital reaching and exceeding 105 million just in 2021. And a large portion of that is coming from Blue Nalu. We'll hear from Lou after this from their most recent raise. Next slide, please. So I spoke a little bit about the demand for food, about the opportunity, but what do consumers want? Recently, at the end of 2020, GFI hired Kelton Global to survey 2,500 US consumers. And the goal was to learn more about their motivations and barriers around consuming plant-based and cultivated seafood. So I'll drop the link in the chat after this so you can read all of the research, but I just wanted to highlight 2 quick charts. This total unduplicated reach and frequency analysis, or TURF chart, demonstrates ideal messaging to reach the maximum number of consumers. So we can see here in that first big circle that taste is table stakes for plant-based seafood and cultivated seafood, which I'll show you on the following slide. And messaging around products' environmental, health, and functional benefits can bring additional consumers into the category once that taste is achieved. So for plant-based seafood, the most compelling environmental messaging is on reduction of overfishing, while the most compelling health benefits are around omega-3 fatty acids. And once consumers have a positive impression of alternative seafood flavor, messaging focused on these benefits is likely to bring more consumers into the segment. Next slide, please. And we see the same overall results for the cultivated turf analysis, the only difference being the specifics of the environmental and health messaging. So for cultivated seafood, messaging about these products, ocean habitat benefits, protein content, lack of fishy smell, and reduction in plastic waste produced by ocean fishing can bring in additional consumers once flavor is achieved. And next slide, please. So talking about alternative seafood as a market white space, what are these white space opportunities in alternative seafood? There are many, but I'm just going to highlight a couple here. So first of all, humans consume about 200 to 300 different species of aquatic animals as seafood. And alternative seafood companies are only making a small handful of those so far. So there's still plenty of space for alternative products for all categories of seafood, and there are really endless opportunities to develop novel products. And secondly, most of the plant-based seafood products currently on the market are breaded or minced. So there's still an opportunity for innovation that can achieve that flaky and delicate texture of fish fillet. There are companies that are really close or doing it already, but there's still a lot of opportunity in that area. Because if you think about the importance that consumers place on health, we can safely assume that a fillet will probably do very well once taste and texture and nutrition are achieved. And lastly, there is little to no plant-based seafood in the refrigerated section of the store or at the seafood counter. And this is where consumers are shopping for conventional seafood. So moving beyond the frozen and shelf-stable products and eliminating those vegan and vegetarian sections will definitely increase the visibility of plant-based seafood and accelerate the growth in the category, similar to the way that refrigerated plant-based milk and meat put in the milk and meat aisles has done. And the last slide we can go to, which just concludes my introduction. Here's my email at the bottom if you want to follow up. And please sign up for our Turning the Tides newsletter if you're interested. It comes out quarterly and it highlights industry news and kind of what our Sustainable Seafood Initiative has been working on. And thank you again so much for having us. I will post some links in the chat in just a moment.
Excellent. Thanks, Marika. Really appreciate that overview and introduction to the topic of sustainable seafood alternatives. So greatly needed if we're going to save our global oceans. I'd like to now turn it over to two of the gentlemen making this all happen in the alternative sustainable seafood space. I'd like to start with Lou Cooperhouse and then followed by Michael Vandermeer to talk about their respective companies, how they got into maybe start with a background on yourselves and then your respective companies, how you got into this space and where you see your how your company contributing to sustainable seafood alternatives. Lou, over to you.
Well, thanks, Brian, and thanks, Emergence, for organizing this tremendous program. It's so critical that we do focus on the seafood sector because this has been so underrepresented, frankly, in the world of proteins. And we're certainly all inspired by the great work of GFI. So thank you, GFI, for the great work that you do. That's really been a catalyst for many founders in this business. Answer your question, Brian. My background is over 35 years in the food industry. Kind of as Marika mentioned, focusing on great tasting products. Culinary is clearly centric with everything that all of us need to do. And that's kind of the foundation of our company as a food industry founder, just really focusing on, as Marika described, a global problem that we have is as demand, and I saw this in my career, as consumers were shifting towards sustainable food. And I was involved and also supporting others as well. But what I realized was there was a transformation that was on the horizon with generation one being plant-based. And as Marika mentioned, you mentioned, Brian, fermentation and cell-based were all generations of different ways. Consumers love choice and all these options were now being made available. And I wasn't necessarily later in life looking to start up another company, but sure enough, I saw this huge need. As was described, the demand is an all-time high, our supply is restricted, but I found something totally unique about seafood versus terrestrial animals. While there's this fundamental supply chain gap, if you take it a step further, it's highly vulnerable. to algae blooms, warming oceans, acidification, the potential to frankly wipe out fish stocks is enormous, let alone overfishing, illegal fishing, but nature can, climate change can have a devastating effect to our supply chain. It's a highly vulnerable, I would argue, the most vulnerable supply chain on the planet of this magnitude. And it wasn't being paid proper attention to, frankly. And then you overlay another issue, the fact that we're shipping seafood maybe 10,000 miles from Southeast Asia to New York City with 30 to 50% bycatch and maybe a 60% yield. I saw this as a supply chain solution that was extraordinary. What if you could make a demand-driven model rather than a supply-restricted model and build factories, a bit like vertical farming is, close to consumer populations, and displacing that huge environmental footprint, let alone the animal suffering and all the other issues with trawling and fishing that we all know about as well. But there's also a human health issue that's unparalleled on the terrestrial animal side. We have microplastics, environmental pollutants, mercury, PCBs, et cetera, in the diet of the fish, unfortunately, due to our own pollution that is getting into our own bodies. So what we can do with plant-based and cell culture seafood is make a product that's mercury-free, no contaminants. It has just beyond sustainability benefits. And frankly, I got so motivated at how we can make such a difference. Consumers want to see benefits. If there's ever a benefit, it's manufacturing seafood in this new way. It offers food security, sustainability, healthier bodies, certainly alleviates dramatically the amount of animal suffering that occurs, and really creates finally a model that can really support us to feed our population of decades to come. So we're at a Blue Nalu, Brian, we're kind of early on identified what does it take to be successful and identify these 5 phases of growth, where phase 5 is what large scale production looks like. This is a very brand new technology, never done before, all sorts of challenges, which we talk more about. And we just really laid out a very thoughtful approach to how we can get to scale over time. And our company was really founded with that in mind. Scale involves regulatory, approval around the world where it's not currently approved anywhere except for now just in Singapore for a sole product, as we know, with chicken nuggets. But the opportunity there is to really develop a safe, healthy process that regulatory agencies could validate, but also all the engineering operations, et cetera, that are required for success. So we're actually building out in San Diego a 40,000 square foot operation that would enable us to get to our middle phases of our 5-phase strategy, generate regulatory clearance, but also generate small scale production. So that will be occurring over the next year. Very exciting pathway forward. And we're all very motivated by what we see as tremendous upside in this whole category, with both cell culture and plant-based really helping displace conventional seafood in the future. So long intro, but thanks, Brian.
Excellent. Thanks, Lou. Really appreciate it. I'd like to turn it over now to, before we open it up to Q&A, I'd like to turn it over to Michael Vandermeer, founder and CEO of Novish, to talk about his plant-based alternative seafood. Michael.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks to Marika and Lou for eloquently explaining why we do what we're doing. So I can skip that part and start with my background, which is actually very similar to Lou's background, 30 years in the food industry. The first 20 years, I worked in flavors food ingredients to make a great taste and texture of all kinds of products. And the last 10 years, I worked in the global fish industry for a company, Mowi, in salmon mainly. And I must say that about 2 or 3 years ago, I got infected by the plant-based virus, which is a lot more friendly than COVID. And I did a project for a meat company and built a big plant for plant-based meat for them, and start to saw the opportunity, the massive opportunity there was. And then I thought, well, with my taste and texture experience, with my fish experience and recent experience in plant-based meat, what is more logical than entering the plant-based fish world? And 1.5 years ago, when we started with my 2 co-founders, Paul and Katja, I was really surprised that it felt like nobody was doing it yet. I mean, except maybe from Good Catch and 1 or 2 others. There wasn't really a plant-based fish in the market. I did store checks everywhere and couldn't see any product. So we started and we were ready to enter the global food service market on March 10 last year. And then with the global lockdown, we obviously had to divert our attention to retail. We are now in 10 countries on the shelf, both in chilled and frozen. and very proud of that achievement. But the biggest success was something we did recently. We were in contact with a very traditional, old-fashioned chain of fish restaurants, headquartered in Germany, operating 300 restaurants across Europe. And we realized that they were only attracting old people. I mean, everybody who was going there was minimum 50, eating the same fish they had been eating for the last 125 years. And we realized that we could really change the formula of the restaurant by introducing vegan alternatives. So we took a fishless fillets, and we took a chunk for like a fish and chip application. We developed a fantastic product which you couldn't distinguish from the real stuff. And together we could offer it at the same price. And we launched at mid-February in 10 restaurants. And even with the restaurant closed, just takeaway and home delivery, the sales were phenomenal. And we developed a vegan tartare sauce to go with it. And that led them to launch the product in all the restaurants on 1st of April. And it's booming, it's ridiculous. And the effect that has had on other customers is enormous. I mean, a lot of similar customers are now looking seriously at our product range, and we hope to expand very quickly. But this week and next week is going to be very exciting, because we're going to enter the US market with our products. With our products we launched at Noordzee's breaded prawns. And yesterday we had the first production of our canned tuna, but then obviously the veggie version of that. And I'm so pleased with the first feedback we have from customers, and we hope it's really going to make inroads in the marketplace. So looking forward to be inspired by all the other panelists going forward, and happy to answer any difficult questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate it. We're going to share the Q&A session together with Elliot, as he has access to all of the questions in the chat room. But I have one off the top of my head. And Marika, this really came from the previous webinar, the spectacular rise of alternative proteins we did a couple of weeks back. There was a slide in that presentation on hybrids. And so I was interested to hear your opinion, Lou and Michael. This is a question for both of you on your view of the hybrid space. That is, hybrid product of part plant-based seafood and part cellular aquaculture. Do you believe that those two industries can coexist and eventually merge into a single product, or will it be one or the other? And I posit that question to both of you.
I can start. Another hybrid, Brian, is plant-based and conventional, which we know is also in the market. So there's plant-based and conventional, and plant-based and cell-based. So I think there's a philosophy called reducitarian that Brian Cateman kind of leads up here, which is about making incremental changes in your diet, because it's really hard to go from to totally convert your lifestyle to not eating animals if that's what you've been eating your entire life. So I think the idea of hybrids makes sense as a pathway towards a more sustainable solution and really reducing your intake of protein over time. The question really comes down to culinary and also the psychology of the consumer. We know that consumers think very differently about the protein on their plate, and they're very forgiving about things like historically sausages and many other products that they think that they consume without even giving another thought. But you play with their protein, it's a different story. But I think in the case of the blended, ground and formed, minced products that are batter, breaded, and fried, candidly, I do think there's a lot more. I'll use the word forgiveness. Meaning consumers are much more willing to be an early adopter in a product in that form than they would be in a product that is more center of the plate. So again, it's a psychology of the consumer that I have a familiarity with, which is really interesting. But I'm certainly a fan of the concept as a pathway. But I think over time we'll see continual evolution in these products becoming increasingly more natural, less ingredient intensive, less process, because consumers will demand those over time. And we'll see more manufacturers that are continually innovating and making cleaner labels and really raising the bar even higher. So just some thoughts there, but Michael.
Thanks, Lou. I think I 110% agree with everything Lou said. I would like to add that the consumer psychology is pretty critical. We noticed that communication to the consumer is very important, and also starting to segment consumer groups and then having tailored propositions for them. And I think that is something which will happen in the next few years, that more focus on eating occasions, consumer groups, and then appropriate communication to really attract those consumers and get that conversion going. I think that will be critical, and hybrids could play a role in that. There have been a series of hybrids on the meat side introduced in the European market and not totally unsuccessful. So, it's all about psychology and communication.
Excellent. Elliot?
And then around that kind of psychology and communication, we have two questions, two related questions, one from Keith and one from Jean-Marc. Both are around the correlation between product and the healthy components that they deliver, and how that gets communicated and what those are and how that gets communicated. So open question for anyone on here, but as you think about being able to identify what the health benefits are, and then how do we communicate that?
Maybe take that one first. I think omega-3 is a good example. Actually, yesterday evening, I had a good discussion with Marika about that. We actually source omega-3 which is directly produced from algae, and we can put it in our product at the appropriate level. And the nice thing, of course, about, in this case, plant-based seafood, is that you can decide how much you put in, from which source, is it sustainable, is it accepted, and of course, it has to be cost effective as well. So the nice thing with plant-based is you can build a product up from scratch, and if you want 3 times as much omega-3, you can put it in. And I think from that perspective, that is the same for all the health components, whether it's protein level. We've chosen for the canned tuna 20% plus protein, salt level, which should be well below the daily usage level, etc., etc. Saturated fats low. So I think the nice thing about the alternatives is you can construct your ideal product rather than you have to take as it comes, with or without mercury, as Lou rightly pointed out.
I could add too, I think, versus terrestrial animals, red meat in particular, consumers have an expectation that seafood is healthier for them, despite the fact that there's a fair amount of, issues that are in the seafood that we consume. It obviously has, better for you when it comes to cholesterol and other health benefits. So I think the opportunity is for consumers to have more seafood in our diet with plant-based and cell culture products, because they do, they feel a little bit torn. They're told by the medical community to have less red meat and more seafood, but then they also hear about microplastics and pollutants and mercury. So what do I do? So what we're doing with cell-based and plant-based is really, if you will, taking off those handcuffs and enabling you to have the seafood that you enjoy without any of the negatives. So I think when it comes to communication, I think consumers want to know that the product has all the positives, which are omega-3s and all the health benefits that seafood represents. But then there's opportunity to also represent that as none of the negatives. So we're talking about sustainability in a new way. We're talking about the absence of mercury and microplastics and pollutants, the associated labor with this industry, the huge environmental footprint. So we do have an enormous opportunity. It's important to demonstrate the positives for sure, but we also have a new opportunity to demonstrate the absence of the negatives. But we want to do that in a careful way. So we're not really, we're working in some sort of relationship with the conventional industry, but nonetheless, we want consumers to recognize that our products do in fact have these tremendous benefits.
And I guess from a metrics perspective, maybe this is a good one for Marika. From a metrics perspective, what is the data showing us, and how can people say, okay, it's great that we have a Blue Nalu and Earth First Food Ventures and a Novish talking about all these benefits, but where are the numbers behind backing up